Good morning, everybody. A very warm welcome to all our Energy Institute members who are here on the call with us, and of course to those of you who are, as yet, not members of the Institute. I'm Joanne Wade. I'm the Chief Strategic Advisor at the Association for Decentralised Energy, and I've also been heavily involved with the Energy Institute for many years now, including as a trustee for 12 years and counting. I'm really delighted to be here this morning to moderate this special webinar. This is to introduce you all to Nick Wayth, who is the EI's new Chief Executive. I will let Nick tell you about himself in a few minutes, but just by way of brief introduction, I do think it's lovely to see that we've got somebody on board whose career is perhaps an example of the sort of journey that we're all taking as energy professionals, as the energy sector, and as the Energy Institute itself. Nick qualified as a mechanical engineer initially and spent more than 2 decades at BP. At first, he worked in fossil fuels around the world, and then latterly was Chief Development Officer of Alternative Energy. He led the company's strategic and business development in renewable technologies. And now he's excited by the challenge of getting to grips with really the full breadth of the energy sector, which is what he's going to be doing at the Energy Institute. I hope you'll agree with me that those are great credentials for leading the Energy Institute into its next chapter. I'm really looking forward to discussing his career to date, some of the big issues we're all facing, and also his aspirations for the organisation. But before I hand over to Nick to say a few words, I really want to stress that today is your chance to hear from Nick. I've got some questions that I'm going to ask him, but I don't just want this to be the two of us sitting here chatting and you guys listening. I want to ask him your questions. So please do send those to us. To ask a question, you can use the chat function, which is on the bottom right of your screen, and send your questions in. And please don't wait till it looks like we're running out of things to say to each other. Just post them as they come to you and we'll feed them in. Please do state your name and affiliation when you post the question. We're going to do our best to answer as many as we can in the time we've got available. There's just one final thing that I would like you to know. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you as registrants after today, and also on the EI's YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Nick to introduce himself.
Well, thank you and good morning, Joanne. It's very nice to see you again. And good morning to everybody online today. Good afternoon to those of you further east in Asia and elsewhere. It's a real pleasure to meet members, fellows, students, and of course our valuable and well-respected volunteers around the world. So I'm really excited to be here. This is a really exciting time in the energy sector, and I personally could not have thought of a more exciting role to be in. I'm looking forward to serving all of you as members and fellows, and supporting everything that you're doing to advance the energy sector. And so looking forward to the conversation today. I'll go back to you, Joanne, and we can go into the questions and take it from there.
Excellent, thank you, Nick. Well, I think it's probably worth us starting with a little bit more about your career to date. Let's find out a bit more about you. So what was it that attracted you to a career in the energy sector?
Well, I think what brought me into the energy sector, I was studying a PhD at the time, sponsored by BP and as was then Statoil, obviously now Equinor. And I just got intrigued by the scale, both geographically, but also the scale of projects in the energy sector, and just had this huge appetite to sort of take some of the engineering skills I had learned and apply them in a very real world sense. So as I think back to some of my really formative early experiences in the industry, I spent time in the North Sea. One of my first roles was on the Forties field, which was clearly one of the early developments in the North Sea, and spent time working offshore on a 2-on 2-off rotation, and just got a real sense of the fact that we were taking molecules of oil and sending them by pipeline into a refinery that was then going into people's cars. And Forties Unity, which is one of the, it's the manifold effectively where that pipeline all comes together from the various fields in the central North Sea. I remember flying out to that. It's an unmanned platform But in my first few months, had the opportunity to go and visit this unmanned platform with a maintenance team, and just the sense of, I think, around 700,000 barrels a day sort of traveling underneath my feet. I mean, you think about that, that's around 50 Olympic-sized swimming pools of crude oil going through into a refinery. Later on, I spent time in Algeria, in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and again, rather than molecules of oil, it was molecules of gas. But just the very notion of those molecules of gas going from the middle of the Sahara, where I was working with a fantastic team, to people's homes in Italy and Spain, about 1,500 kilometers north of where we were. So I think there was a real sense of scale and purpose. And I mean, the other exciting thing was this was just a few years after John Brown, or Lord Brown, the former chief executive of BP, had famously spoken at Stanford in 1997, and he had been the first oil executive to really recognise the impact of climate change and that things had to change. So yeah, even back then, there was a palpable sense that the industry was going to change, and this was the start of something very exciting for me. So it's been a wonderful sector to be in. And later on in my career, you know, I really enjoyed taking some of those experiences and seeing them in a different context in the renewable sector, in solar, offshore wind, and other new technologies.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because obviously I come from a very different perspective. You know, I come from it from the demand side, from the really local, from the really small scale. But I think you echo some of the same things that and I think most of us love about being in the sector, because it's the idea that energy matters. You know, it's an important thing, but also that there's the challenges and the changes and the transformations that I think we all find so exciting and so rewarding about being part of this sector. You mentioned, as you were talking there, a number of locations. I mean, your BP career took you all around the world. What are your impressions from that sort of that massive international experience, those contrasts of the sector and its people? I mean, what are your reflections on our sector?
It was, I mean, it was a fascinating experience to see different operations, different people around the world. And I think some of my most formative learning experiences were in working and leading people in remote locations. Yeah, I think, I mean, the scenery, you know, it changes dramatically from the hostile North Sea to the hostile Sahara Desert to jungle to, you know, all to prairies, to all types of different terrain. The political backdrop changes, but I think, you know, fundamentally the things that people are hoping for, are aspiring to, are very much the same. I think everywhere I worked, I saw people that cared deeply about safety and the fact that they and their colleagues would go home safely to their families. And you know, and that's really, really important when people are away from their families. You know, knowing that they will go back safely. A care for the environment, you know, that was consistent wherever I worked. And I think just the sense of purpose of what they were doing for their own country, around developing their economy, bringing energy, and making their societies better places for all of the population. So I think, you know, despite all those huge differences, you know, the things that people cared about, the things that people wanted to do, were very much the same. I was also struck by, and I think this is very true of the energy sector, and I think the oil and gas sector has done this very well, a sense of partnership and collaboration. In Algeria, I worked alongside colleagues from Sonatrach, from Statoil, and a sense that by working together, the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. Yeah, it's not always easy balancing the sort of different targets and aspirations of different partners, but that sense that together we can do more than if we were by ourselves. And I'm excited to see how that's evolving into other parts of the energy sector. But I think that's something that the oil and gas sector has done really, really well over many, many decades.
I think that's really interesting, because I think that sense of needing to work together is ever increasing as the challenges we face get more complicated.
Absolutely.
You're an engineer by training. I'm quite definitely not. I'm a scientist, but I'm not an engineer. Um, what what do you think it is about engineers? What can they uniquely bring to the problems that and the net zero challenge that we face? But also, who else do they need around the table?
Well, I think engineers. I mean, it, it's all about problem solving, I think, and I realize that scientists solve a lot of problems as well, and I won't go into dangerous territories of making these comparisons, but I think fundamentally engineers sit behind every aspect of the energy sector. And I think the ingenuity, the belief, as as you think about how the energy sector has evolved, when the first projects happened in the North Sea, this was really frontier stuff. Nobody had worked in those types of environments, offshore, huge weather considerations. And I think that ability to believe that humans, engineers, can overcome the technical challenges of working in these environments is astonishing. And if you think back to how the energy sector has evolved in terms of the ability to go into deeper water, into longer wells, there's a huge amount of engineering prowess that's gone into that. But it's not just in oil and gas. You think about offshore wind, where initially we had 2 megawatt turbines that we took offshore, and today we're seeing 12, 15 megawatts, and people talking about 17, 19, and who knows where that's going to go. And it's not just about scale, it's about the cost. Offshore wind in the UK coming down from £150 a megawatt hour to less than £40 a megawatt hour today. Engineers have driven that through ingenuity, through their belief and conviction, but also just through really good engineering, through driving standardization, through making things work better. So I think there's a massive amount that engineers have achieved. But I also think that this is such a broad and complex area that it requires so many other disciplines. And I think there's a huge amount, and love to hear your perspectives on this, Joanne, around how we bring different skill sets together. If I were to be maybe a little bit critical of engineers, and I hope I can say this as one myself, I think sometimes the engineering mindset sort of forgets how societies think about things, how politicians think about things. You mentioned about the demand side, and I think one of the things that the energy industry has done, certainly from a sort of an oil and gas perspective, and maybe from a centralized sort of power perspective, is had the view that we can build it and just sell the molecules or the electrons, and the customer sometimes gets forgotten in that. So thinking about how we bring in customers' perspectives, how we bring in broader societal perspectives, I think is really important. And we only achieve that by bringing different disciplines working together to tackle the problems that we're trying to solve.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you're so right there. I mean, I very much agree with you that we need these multidisciplinary teams. Um, and you've talked very eloquently about the way engineers solve problems, and I totally agree with you and how fantastic engineers are at doing that. I think we all collectively, and this is not a point about engineers, this is about the energy sector as a whole, we are really good at building multidisciplinary teams to provide the solution. What we're not so good at is building multidisciplinary teams that ask a different question. And this comes to your point about the perspective of the consumer. And do we really think about that? Because we have all been collectively, I think, a little bit guilty of saying we've got this given of energy demand and we are going to find the best way to meet it. And we've been really good at doing that. What we haven't said is, what is it that people really want? And what's the best solution to deliver what they really want? I mean, you talked earlier about how our colleagues in the energy sector have the same fundamental aims. And I think, you can say that more broadly about people. There are a bunch of things, fundamental things that we want out of life to live well. And we need to get better as a sector of saying, how do we do that? And that might not be by using more energy or just supplying more energy. And I think this is where the Energy Institute can come in. It's incredibly difficult to give you an example, an engineer and a sociologist to have a conversation because they speak different languages, frankly. But we need to have those conversations and we need to facilitate those conversations if we are going to build on our history of delivering amazing things for people and do it even better going forwards. And I think, you know, that doing it better is very much around it's an issue of diversification of what we as a sector do. Now, you yourself were instrumental in BP's recent diversification, things like investment in light source. What do you think is going on? What are the big push and pull factors that are at play within the majors boardrooms, for example? BP's clearly stepping out in front, but how do you see the rest of the pack responding, particularly people outside of Europe, to the challenge, this challenge we've got at the moment?
Well, I think it's a really fascinating discussion, and I was privileged to be at the heart of a lot of the conversations in BP. And I mean, I think you know, the first thing I would say is I think every boardroom is taking this seriously, and you know, this is now a conversation. It may not have been sort of 5 years ago, but it absolutely is now. I think we need to recognise that it's a different journey for every organisation out there. You know, as I think about, you know, how society reaches net zero, you know, every organisation is going to have some agenda about its own journey towards that, and in some cases, you know, it's got to be negative emissions. You know, it's reaching net zero. You know, individually is not enough to get there in aggregate, because there will still be emissions. You know, I think it's it's a really complex discussion in terms of how do you get the pace right. You know, I think there's also a lot of learning around, you know, how do businesses really pivot their business models? It requires different ways of thinking. As I think back to some of the conversations I had, there was an awful lot of learning about new areas such as solar, such as offshore wind. These are fundamentally different business models. If you think about, you know, oil and gas as a commodity where the price is really, you know, at the vagaries of the market, in the power sector, it's a very different business model. The financing model is very different. I also think we need to recognise that the journey is not the same for everyone. You know, the journey for an integrated, for an independent E&P is a very different journey for a company that has set itself up as an independent renewable player. The journey for an airline is going to be a very different journey for a company that runs data centers, for example. So I think we need to recognize that this is going to be harder for some people. We also need to recognize that, you know, it being harder is not necessarily, is not an excuse for companies doing less. I also think there's something really, really important here about playing to capabilities. And one thing that I really thought about and others really thought about in my previous world was, where is it that we bring the right capabilities? Where do our skills play into this new world? And so thinking about, you know, how do I take my oil and gas capabilities and position those in offshore wind or in CCUS or in hydrogen? And I think that becomes you know, it can become quite a specific thing for individual organizations, but that mapping, I think, is really important. And at the same time, realizing that it's not static. You know, once you go into a new area, you learn. And so I think there's a huge amount about how we think about that skills transfer, both in a linear sense, but also in a more creative sense through time as that capability evolves. And I do think, I mean, the EI, I think, has a huge opportunity, as it already has done, to continue to sort of help the energy sector on this journey, bringing people from all sides of the energy complex together to try and tackle some of these challenges together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think your emphasis on it's a learning process there, it is really important and really chimes with me. I think, you know, when we're dealing with the sort of the radical level of transition that we need to achieve that's happening at the moment, it's more than ever, it's more important than ever that we listen to one another and we learn from one another and we listen to that range of views. You know, whether it's energy supply and energy demand, whether it's old versus new fuels. I don't want to use the word versus, really, but old and new fuels. What are the innovators doing? What are the disruptors doing? And how does that fit with, as you say, the playing to your strengths when you're an incumbent? You know, how does that all come together? And I think the fact that the Energy Institute is this big tent where we can all come together and have that sensible conversation, frankly, that's the reason why I've been involved for as long as I have. That's the value to me of an institute like this. Absolutely. Um, and I think it's worth us having a bit of a think now about your new role at the Energy Institute and where we're going with that. Just before we move on to talking about that, I can see that some things are coming in to the chat, and I just want to first of all encourage people to keep putting your questions in there. I just want to take one now before we move on and
Sure.
carry on talking. So Helen Bucock, who works in the manufacturing sector as an HSE administrator, has asked, what are your plans to encourage young people into the energy and engineering sectors as an institute? And how will you encourage them to join the EI as a path to chartership?
Well, Helen, thank you for the question, and it's great to hear from you. Firstly, I should say and recognise, the passion and excitement I already see in the young professionals within the EI. It's really, really exciting to see what's already happening, and so certainly, step one is continuing to build on that. I do think, the reality is there is a challenge around diversity in who's coming into the energy sector, and a lot of that is around STEM and how we engage people at a really sort of formative age. And so, I am curious around what more can we do as the EI. Know we already engage with at schools around the Big Bang Challenge on an annual basis. Is there more we can potentially be doing at a school age? It's interesting just speaking to people around the impact at even a very young age, and I'm talking sort of 6 or 7 years old, of engaging, real youngsters in how engineering affects the world, and really getting more girls at that stage engaged in that as well is going to be absolutely critical. So I mean, this is something I'm really passionate about. I think that the work that the EI has done, led by the young professionals around Generation 2050, is really setting out, what does the energy complex need to look like in 30 years' time? What are the skills we need? And I think one thing I would speak very powerfully about is that the workforce within the energy sector today does not represent society as well as it should do. And so we need to think really carefully about how we bring people through, how we bring the right development, how we help engineers become chartered through the EI, and how we help non-engineers reach professional accreditation through the EI. So I think there's a huge amount to do there. And then even when we've kind of reached that sort of professional accreditation, how do we retain people in the energy sector? Steve Holliday, who I'm sure many of you know is the president of the EI, he talked about this sort of leaky pipeline where we lose talent as people progress through the careers. So understanding more around how we continue to develop those individuals, how we see those individuals and females in particular, and people from other sort of minorities beginning to sort of take on more of the executive roles and boardrooms is going to be really crucial if we're going to reach net zero. And I do think that there is a really strong linkage between the net zero agenda and diversity, and I would really like the EI to be at the heart of that conversation. Thank
Absolutely.
you,
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I think when you look at some of the things that the EI is starting to do, like the new fellowship initiative that we've just launched, that I'm involved in, it is all about trying to make the EI accessible to a wider range of people, and therefore providing those role models for a wider range of people to say, look, there are people like you in this sector, which is another element of it. This is not a sector full of one type of person. This is I know it's not anywhere near diverse enough, but there is diversity in the sector. And if we can celebrate that, and if we can bring people into the fellowship to do that, I think that would be great. So I think we're already starting to get, from your answer to that question, we're starting to get a bit of a feeling for what you're passionate about and what you want to do with the Institute. But this is a venerable organisation. It's got a long story. It's been around for well over a century, if you think about its precursor organisations as well, and it's changed a lot over that time. What was it about now that made you want to take over the helm at this point?
Well, I think, I honestly think that there could not be a more exciting time to be in the energy sector. When I joined the energy sector, it was around the time of the dot-com boom, and there was part of me that sort of thought, "Am I in the right space?" This this industry, it's not clear where it's going. It felt a bit uncomfortable actually telling friends, what I did, what I worked for. Um, and I couldn't be prouder or more excited to be part of this sector right now. I just think it is incredibly exciting, and so the opportunity to really sort of manage, help the sector drive this transition. And I think what drew me to the EI was the fact that it has such a broad membership, and I think that's so important. I, I passionately believe that, and people, I think people hold the energy sector as sort of diverging. It's one part of it kind of going away, new energy coming in, and there's this divergence. I fundamentally disagree with that point of view. I think there's a real convergence. What do I mean by that? Well, as we think about the old world, oil was produced, it was refined, it was put in a car. Um, Electrons were produced separately, and the two never sort of crossed over. If we think about the future world now, we're going to see molecules being turned into electrons through hydrogen. We're going to see electrons being turned into molecules, and we're going to see this sort of real convergence and crossing over of different energy value chains. And I think that reinforces the need for all of those capabilities to play across. And I think the EI has a really unique opportunity, and it's been demonstrating this for many years. So I think a track record as well that demonstrates we can bring some of the capabilities. We can bring the capabilities in offshore safety in oil and gas, and we can help the offshore wind sector through the G Plus program really build out its safety performance. There are things that the oil and gas sector can learn from offshore wind if we think about project standardization and delivery. I think there's also this massive systems opportunity to really think about, well, how does this whole system fit together? And so this ability to sort of bring people with us on that journey for people who may today sit in an oil and gas role, and clearly, for many of those people, continuing to produce oil and gas safely, reliably, more cheaply, more less carbon intensely is going to be a really big focus. And also creating pathways where those people can see those skills are relevant in CCUS, in hydrogen, in offshore wind, I think is so exciting. So I think there's a real opportunity for the EI to really help bring the industry together, not create this sense of divergence. And the other thing is, I saw real conviction from the EI Council, from the team, from my predecessor, that there was this real conviction that the EI had this role to play in driving the energy transition. And I talked about diversity and inclusion before, and I saw real leadership in that space. So I think that track record gave me real confidence that this was a place I wanted to step into and take further.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love hearing you talk about how your brain is pulling together the different bits of the sector that you know a bit about, and I'm really looking forward going forwards to our conversation as you learn about the bits of the sector that you haven't yet worked in and worked directly with. When we start thinking about flexibility and storage and energy efficiency, I can see it's going to be a fun conversation with you as your brain starts to pull those in and see how those fit together as well. So I am definitely looking
Well, I
forward
have
to
to
that.
confess to you, I am a bit of an energy geek, and I spend a lot of my time listening to podcasts, including the EI's Energy in Conversation podcast. And I am always fascinated by how much more there is to learn. So I've learned enough to be a little bit dangerous in flexibility and demand side response, but a lot more to learn. So looking forward to learning from you and others on that, Joanne.
Excellent, excellent. Um, what do you think the EI is going to look like in 2030? You've talked a little bit about the diversification and including a much broader range of people within the sector. Are there other elements to what you see as your defining task going forwards and how you're going to change the place?
Well, it's early days, so I don't want to make too many predictions yet. But I mean, I think first I would say that the EI, has already pivoted and made some bold moves. So if I think about the EI itself in its own net zero targets, I think it has acted and led in terms of its sort of progression around energy transition and in terms of building a very diverse set of members and indeed a team. I think at the heart of it, we are here to serve our members. All of you on the call today. I think it's really important we continue to play a very significant role in how we develop members. I talked a little bit about that before, but how we deliver the right sort of professional development that allows people to continue to develop in one path, or potentially to move from one path to another path as they think about a broader career in energy. I think the legacy of collaboration across the sector, that really is also fundamental to what we do, and how we continue to provide that safe, convening space where we can bring people from all sides of the energy debate together, to have a really sort of, a fact-based, thorough debate, and really sort of lead the thinking and help government, help society really think about the energy transition. And there are some big debates I see going on right now. If I were to sort of throw one into the mix, hydrogen and heat pumps in domestic heating, I think, at the moment that debate is quite polar. I do believe the EI can play a role in helping people bring that debate together and having more of a fact-based discussion rather than sort of an emotional-led discussion. I think the work that the EI does around its good practices, the technical practices we do, I mentioned G+, there's also Safety On, and a whole bunch of other really well developed good practices, which the EI sort of, again, it convenes. We've got some fantastic technical experts within our team, but what makes it so powerful is drawing in real experts from our member organizations from across the energy spectrum to really kind of create industry leading good practice. And so continuing to build out what we're doing in offshore wind, continuing to build out CCUS, hydrogen, and sort of thinking about you talked a lot about flexibility, Joanne, what role can we play in sort of integrated power systems with flexibility, storage, demand side. I think there's a lot we can do to really help develop the sort of good practice that will sort of set the industry up for success in the future, as well as continuing to do all of the great legacy stuff we do, which continues to be very relevant. And then I think lastly, I would just touch upon sort of the evolution of our membership. And I think, how do we continue to sort of build on the great work of the Young Professionals Group, but also as those young professionals become slightly less young, if I to put it like that, how do we continue to be relevant for them? How do we kind of help them through that mid part of their career and sort of position them to be, the future leaders of the industry, whilst bringing in the next wave of young professionals? So I think that's a really exciting opportunity. I think the Generation 2050 program provides a bit of a catalyst to bring that thinking together. And I would love to see that membership continuing to really evolve in its sort of representation of society, both where we are sitting today in the UK, but around the world with our many fantastic branches that are developing a real sense of a global community around helping people, energy professionals, solve the challenges that they're facing each day.
Absolutely, absolutely. You talked there about expanding our good practice and our technical standards work and looking at new elements, and also broadening the people we bring in. And I think one of those disruptor technologies that we've alluded to a bit is energy storage and how that fits in the system. And Dilip Patel has put a question in the chat here that says the storage technologies for energy will be key to success for renewable energy. How will the Energy Institute help to support development of better energy storage technologies?
Well, Dilip, good morning, and it's nice to hear from you again. I think storage is absolutely part of the mix. And I think, we're not an organization which sort of does R&D. So, I don't think we as an organization will come up with the next sort of battery chemistry that will sort of make batteries half the price and twice as good. But I think if I go back to the point I made before about the integration of all these systems, I do think there is something that the EI can sort of facilitate in terms of how do we think about the energy complex at large? What's sort of the system modeling around this that helps governments, policymakers just think about, well, what role should storage have versus, and battery storage versus other forms of storage versus hydrogen. And I think, it is such a complex debate technically, but it also brings in sort of political choices, societal choices. That if we can provide that space to kind of help people understand it, and here are the facts. Here's what it would take for storage plus renewables to compete with other alternatives. I also think, coming back to the technical practices, a lot of these new areas do not have the same level of sort of good and consistent technical practices. As I think about my experiences in renewables, the reality is the oil and gas industry has learned, often unfortunately the hard way, but over many, many decades, how to drive safety, process integrity. And the oil and gas industry today, against many other industries, is amongst the safest out there, certainly if you compare it to areas such as construction. So how do we take that learning? And I think sometimes there's a little bit of a reluctance for new industries to sort of learn from older industries. And I think we can help break through that. We can take some of the emotion. This is not about, a particular sector pushing its standards into another area. It's about the EI taking the best wherever it comes from and helping those new areas work together to sort of deliver more safe, consistent, and environmentally sound practices. And it's important to mention that we do need to think about the environmental aspects of renewables and storage, because all of these areas will have environmental impacts, both good and less good.
Mm. Absolutely. And, indeed, I mean, the EI is already publishing technical guidance around storage, looking with HSE and also thinking about helping local authorities understand the technology when they're looking at planning applications, because that can always be a stumbling block for anything that's a bit new. If planners don't understand it's a real barrier to improvement and to progress. So it's good to see that we're already doing that. We're starting to get some questions in around the EI and its relationship with various stakeholders. So I think it's probably a good time to move on to thinking about the overall role for professional membership bodies in the race to net zero. So I mean, this is not just energy, but more generally, what is it about a professional body that's its USP in the race to zero?
Well, I think, I'm a member of the IMechE, and I have been for many, many years. And I think, all of the professional bodies that are out there, I think firstly, we talked a lot about development today, and they are all playing a huge role in development, CPD, routes to accreditation, routes to fellowship. And I think that sort of continued learning journey is really important. And I think the thing that excites me so much about this role and so much about the energy sector is I'm learning more, as much, if not more, every day than when I first joined the energy sector over 20 years ago. So I think that role of training is critical. I also think, we talked a lot about that sort of unbiased space where these bodies are respected, and I think there's that creates a sort of safe space. It creates a credibility that not all bodies have, and I think that's really important. I also think that there's a massive amount of opportunity for us to collaborate together, and I've had some interactions with some of the other PEIs, and will be no doubt engaging with many others. And I think how we work together, we should recognise the EI perhaps has a unique space within the energy sector, but we don't play in areas so much around construction, aviation, around automotive, which other professional bodies do bring in. So again, thinking about, well, how can we best serve, the whole of society as a collective of professional bodies is important. And I also think we need to be careful to coordinate and make sure we're not duplicating. I don't know if this is true, but somebody told me just yesterday that there are now so many associations in the United States that there's now an association of associations to try and coordinate it all. So I think let's work together, let's collaborate, and I think I would ask of our members and fellows. Many of you sit across multiple organisations and can be part of that sort of convening and collaboration, bring things together, joining the dots. Where you see potential duplication, try and bring things together, call it out.
Absolutely. It's a frequent plaintive cry that I hear from government, which is, please, could you just all talk to us as one voice rather than us having to talk to so many of you.
Absolutely.
On the topic of government, we've got a question from Philip Jackson, which I think you've actually largely answered, but let's see if there's anything else you want to say. Philip says the EI is in a very unusual position to speak to government with engineering and project management expertise and without special pleading. How do you believe the EI should use its position to help government with policy more than projects? For example, how do we highlight to government the environmental and energy inefficiencies of sourcing 75% of its gas from outside the UK?
So I think, it comes back to that sort of credibility and that unbiased view. I think as the EI, we can talk about all aspects of energy, and we can do that in a fact-based, unemotional manner, that, and we can convene people from across industry to sort of represent the breadth of perspectives. And if I think about some of in the short space of time I've been enrolled, we've interfaced with government, bringing together leaders from across the industry around things like the Green Jobs Task Force. And I've seen the power of just bringing diverse perspectives from all parts of the energy sector, people with different backgrounds, bringing that together in a safe space, and really sort of helping government understand the perspectives of industry. So I think there's an awful lot that the EI has done. I know my predecessor Louise met with the energy minister just a few weeks ago. So we have that voice with government, and it's really important we continue to engage in that debate. I think we do need to be really careful about taking a view. I think that would undermine that credibility. So I'm not going to respond to the 75% of natural gas point, Philip, but I think it's a well-made point. So thank you for the question.
Absolutely, and I think in that that careful balancing we have about what's our view and what's our impartial advice. I think one of the really important things that we do is the energy barometer that we publish each year, which I was involved in as chair of the EAP for quite a while. What are the collective views of our membership, who are the professionals in the sector? It brings those views, and we do also provide training in the fundamentals of energy for people in Whitehall and people in Holyrood to help them see that wider picture, which is this theme we keep coming back to. What is the whole system looking down, breaking down those silos, which of course we've talked about how important it is for the sector. It's also important for the policymaker. It improves policymaking if you are not in your little silo and not thinking about anything else.
I think that's very true, Joanne, and I think the energy barometer is coming out very shortly, so we'll have some interesting perspectives from that. But I read a lot of press and media around the energy sector, and I think if your worldview was only informed by the media, I think you could have a very different view as to how the energy sector actually works. So I think that's a really important point.
Absolutely. We've talked quite a lot about diversity and talent and how the EI supports and works with members right across the energy system. The sector looks very different in its different elements and its different places, and we're on quite a journey at the moment. How are you going to take everybody with you?
I think it comes back to some of the points I spoke about before, Joanne, in terms of the convergence of energy that certainly I see. Others may see it differently, but I'm very comfortable that every part of the energy sector has a role to play, and it will evolve and change, and and the carbon content clearly needs to go down and negative in some cases. But I think it's about being relevant to everyone. So I think I talked a lot about professional development. It's helping people see how their skill set can play across into other parts of the energy sector. So how do you help a geophysicist move from looking after a reservoir with hydrocarbons in to a reservoir looking after carbon dioxide? How do you help a rotating equipment engineer go from a world of compressors and pumps on an oil and gas platform to rotating turbines, so that she can see that pathway to move across to a new industry? So I think that sort of development's really important. We've talked about the good practices and the technical side, and I think that again is around sort of bridging across different parts of the energy complex, being seen as the sort of the honest broker, in that safety is about people, and if we as the EI can really help reduce the number of people who get hurt each year across the energy complex, wherever they're sitting, I think that's really important. I also want to kind of recognise the work that the volunteers in the EI do across all of this, and without those volunteers, frankly, we wouldn't exist, and it plays out in all of the technical practices that we develop. It plays out in the branches around the world that bring huge amount of passion and excitement. And I also think that helps bring people together. I think when you get people from different parts of the energy industry talking to each other, they begin to understand the language, and they realize that actually they care about the same things, they're trying to achieve the same things. And I think that just helps people feel, okay, we're all trying to solve the same problem here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think personally, I think the most exciting ways we bring people together is through our young professionals networks, our YPNs. And we've actually had a question in from Irina Bonavino, who says, what's your measure of success for the YPNs? So that's one question on younger people. And there's a related but different one from Tony Barber, who is really happy about focus on recruiting young ambassadors and things, but wants to know, how can the engagement with more schools be achieved? Because that's quite vital as well. So YPN success in schools.
Well, Irina, Tony, thank you for the questions. I love what I've seen in the young professionals, and I'm looking forward to engaging with as many of you as possible as soon as I can. I'm not going to be so bold as to sort of say what success looks like for that group, because I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. I think, the one comment I would make is two comments. I'd love to see that Generation 2050 work that has been so pivotal and led by the YPN to continue to really evolve and gain more traction in terms of where the energy industry should go. That really can form a central piece of how we talk to society, how we talk as the EI to government and to broader stakeholders. The other thing I personally would love to see is how that pipeline of young professionals move through the industry and really represent the diversity. And so playing into many of you will have seen the Powerful Women report just last week on sort of the state of the energy sector, and it's pretty stark when 28% of the energy companies in that survey, this is a UK focused survey, but I imagine around the world would be much the same. 20% of those companies don't have a single female board member. Around 2/3 don't have a single executive director who is a female. So there's so much more we need to do, and I think that young professional group will be a very pivotal part of really bringing through much greater diversity, inclusion, equality, equity into the sector. I'm sorry,
Absolutely.
I haven't responded to Tony's question on schools. I mean,
Yes.
again, I don't want to presume to have the answer here, so I would love to hear what you think, Tony, and what others think. Um, I mean, from a personal perspective, I've got two young children, and I, I'm struck by just how, a seemingly sort of small experience in life can be so pivotal. Taking a young child to see a wind turbine from below, or, them seeing a solar panel firsthand, or somebody coming into their school to talk about, science and technology and the role of that in energy. So I can't help but feel there's more we can do in that space. I think it'd be premature to sort of jump to an answer, but I would love to hear what you all think about that. How can we, as the EI, with our wonderful network of expertise and capabilities, really play into that in a far more powerful way?
Mm. It's a really interesting topic for more discussion, isn't it?
It is.
As you were talking about boardrooms there, you mentioned it was a UK survey that you were talking about, and we've had a question actually about internationalisation and the EI. So Stuart Broadley of the EIC says, do you aim to further internationalise the EI, or is the focus more to work on UK focused energy and skills transition as a more urgent and present priority?
Well, Stuart, thank you for the question. And again, early days. To me, it's not an all. It's not, this or that. I think it's a both, but I think it's about doing both in a meaningful way. I think the energy system is global, and I passionately believe that the EI, needs to play to a global membership, and really help transfer learning from one geography to another, and recognize that, every country is in a slightly different place in terms of the energy transition. We haven't talked much about energy poverty, but the reality is today that 800 million people thereabouts don't have access to electricity. 2.6 billion people don't have access to clean cooking fuel. So at the same time, we're talking about energy transition and net zero, which is clearly the predominant conversation in Europe. How are we and our members helping the world where it hasn't seen the benefit of energy like we have develop and see the same quality of life and progress that we have enjoyed here in the UK and in much of the developed world? I, you know, I think there's a balance here, but I think, the new world of everything being virtual, I think has opened up. It doesn't matter where people are sitting around the world. Time zones can get a bit tricky, but are not insurmountable. I think we need to be relevant globally, but I also think there's a really exciting narrative around how the UK, which really has been a leader in energy transition, both in terms of targets, the first developed nation to give out a net zero target, but also leading through in terms of its actions, in terms of developing the world's largest offshore wind sector, for example. So how do we take some of those capabilities elsewhere in the world, and indeed learn from other parts of the world? So to me, it's a bit of a both answer, and I'm sure the thinking on that will develop through time. But thank you for the question.
Absolutely. We're getting quite short on time now, Nick. We're almost at the end of our allotted slot. We've answered quite a few of the questions. Apologies to anybody if we haven't got to your question yet, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But just to finish with, I think it's worth reflecting on the immediate past. The past year has been tough. Here's a bit of a personal question for you to finish this. What have you been most affected by during the COVID process, and what do you think the legacy will be? Are we going to return to business as usual? Is this whole shock that we've had going to help the transition to net zero, or is it going to hinder it? What are your thoughts on the past 12 months?
Yeah. So I mean, and personally for me and my family, we've had, I would say a relatively comfortable and, not bad period. Um, we haven't been directly affected by any friends or family being taken seriously ill. I have to say I found a newfound respect for teachers, and home learning is not something I would like to return to any time soon. And at the same time, it's been wonderful to get to know how my kids are learning and to be part of that journey. And indeed, when we had the sort of parents' evening call the other day, we did recognise that it was also us giving feedback as part-time teachers to our son's teacher. I think there is a massive opportunity to reinvent how we work. I don't know what that looks like yet. I think everybody is talking about the new way of working, and hybrid, and I have yet to see anybody that's really defined what that means. I'm really excited about what it means in terms of democratizing people's ability to collaborate together. No longer is London, for example, the heart of everything that the EI does. Somebody sitting in Singapore can engage, or Lagos, or wherever it is, can engage on equal terms in terms of using their technology. But I think we need to figure out what that means. I also think that the past sort of 15 months have demonstrated how human ability to sort of react and respond to an existential crisis has been unprecedented. And when you step back, despite all of the tragedy that has happened, is phenomenal. And that kind of draws me to sort of the climate emergency. And in some respects, it feels a little bit like we're sort of slow motion car crash, going towards this thing called climate change and the climate emergency. And perhaps this becomes a catalyst for us to really sort of think about this differently and to accelerate the need to act, which we absolutely do. So I'm optimistic about the future and what sort of the new world may look like, but I also think a dose of realism that we need to keep what has changed for the positive, but also recognise the challenges that many people are still facing around the world. And I realise that the situation around coronavirus, it feels different today sitting in the UK than it does in India and other parts of the world. So, we need to recognise that not everybody is in the same place at the same time on this.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Nick. I could happily carry on this conversation for a lot longer, but unfortunately we can't. So I'd like to thank you for your thoughts, and also thank you to everybody who's tuned in this morning. I hope you found it interesting. You're going to be able to read more about Nick's view of the energy transition and his aspirations for the Energy Institute in his column in the June Energy Institute magazines, which are published next week. If you'd like to contact him about anything you've heard today, you can email him at ceo@energyinst.org. So that's a nice, easy one to remember. And I would also say, finally, if you're on the call this morning and you're not yet a member of the Energy Institute, I really would encourage you to join. Our ranks are growing across all aspects of global energy. You can see some details on the slide here of what to do to join. So all that leaves me to say is, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joanne.